Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, I want to welcome you to our first book talk of 2022. My name is Lori Lambert, and I'm the secretary for ASWAD. We are so pleased to present The Deepest Dye, Obeah, Hosay, and Race in the Atlantic World by Aisha Khan, which is published by Harvard University Press. And today, Professor Khan is in conversation with Professor Kamari Clark from the University of Toronto, Professor Diana Payton from the University of Edinburgh, Professor Rhoda Reddick from the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine. I'm going to keep the bios short and share links to their extended bios for our panelists in the chat. So I'll start with these short introductions, and then Professor Khan is going to give us a brief overview of The Deepest Dye before we hear from the discussants. I'm going to ask you all to post your questions using the Q&A function, which is available at the bottom of your screen. So Professor Aisha Khan is Associate Professor of Anthropology at New York University, where she's affiliated with the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Prison Education Program, and the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies and the History Department. Along with The Deepest Dye, she is the author of Callaloo Nation, Metaphors of Race and Religious Identity Among South Asians in Trinidad, the editor of Islam and the Americas, and co-editor of Empirical Futures, Anthropologists and Historians Engage the Work of Sidney W. Mintz. Professor Kamari Clark is a distinguished professor at the University of Toronto with the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. Clark has published 9 books, 3 monographs, and 6 edited volumes with over 50 refereed journal articles and book chapters. She's the author of Affective Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the Pan-Africanist Pushback, Fictions of Justice, and Mapping Yoruba Networks. Next, we have Diana Payton, who is the William Robertson Professor of History at the University of Edinburgh. She's the author of The Cultural Politics of Obeah, Religion, Colonialism, and Modernity in the Caribbean World, No Bond But the Law, Punishment, Race, and Gender in Jamaican State Formation, 1780 to 1870, and editor of A Narrative of Events Since the 1st of August, 1834 by James Williams, an apprentice laborer in Jamaica. Professor Payton is also co-editor of Obeah and Other Powers, The Politics of Caribbean Religion and Healing, and Gender and Slave Emancipation in the Atlantic World. Finally, we have Professor Rhoda Reddick, who's Professor Emerita and former Deputy Principal at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. She's the author of Interrogating Caribbean Masculinities, Theoretical and Empirical Analysis, Women, Labor, and Politics in Trinidad and Tobago, A History, and Elma Francois, the NWCSA, and the Workers' Struggle for Change in the Caribbean. Professor Reddick is also co-editor of Women Plantation Workers, International Experiences, Caribbean Sociology, Introductory Readings, and Sex, Power, and Taboo, Gender, and HIV in the Caribbean and Beyond. So next, we will turn to Professor Aisha Khan to give us an overview of The Deepest Dye.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening, maybe for some. I want to thank all of you who are here very much for joining us on this, for me, very exciting and very high honor moment as we discuss The Deepest Dye. And I want to just very quickly, before I do a very brief overview of the book, just express my profound gratitude to Lori Lambert and all of her colleagues at ASWAD for making this happen, for inviting me in the first place, and absolutely monumental gratitude, always and forever, to my panelists who are and interlocutors who are also my friends as well as colleagues. And I hope that you all, in reading the book, will see all of their work infused in the pages of the book. I really, and without wanting to sound too maudlin, I can easily go there So let me just say in a very, sober fashion, without tears, I don't think this work could have been done without the work of my interlocutors and my friends on this panel. And I want to say, I think it's an example of the kind of collective work that we do, whether or not it's deliberate kind of collective that's formed and working together consciously. I think there's also collective work that happens as we think through and think with the work that our colleagues and friends produce. So I want to say hats off to you and deep, deep gratitude for spending time with me, reading the book and talking about it. But let me just do very briefly give a little bit of an overview. I think by the end of this, we'll have a pretty good idea of what the book is. But let me just say that, I've always been interested in the way, since I've, started on this journey, interested in the ways that the concept of identity works as both a foundation for inequality and as an instrument through which power hierarchies are reinforced. Excuse me, a foundation for equality, and yet also as an instrument through which power hierarchies are reinforced. So, and this, I tackle this in various ways in various works that I've produced, but I really felt like I wasn't getting to the place where I had as firm grasp as I wanted to have on this kind of for me, a conundrum, an endlessly fascinating conundrum. All right. And we're all informed by our own backgrounds in terms of what our interests are, et cetera. So identity has always been kind of an issue in various ways for me. So in pursuing this for this book, I thought a way into the seeming contradiction of what the work that the concept of identity does between reinforcing hierarchy and yet being a foundation for equality. I thought the way into the seeming contradiction was through the concept of intersectionality and what I conceived of as a parallax view. And the concept of intersectionality, absolutely, I took from Kimberly Crenshaw's work, and then also tried to weave in some of the critiques of the concept from folks like Adolph Reed, but still coming into my own use of the term and why I found it useful to enter into this kind of figuring out this puzzle. And the parallax view I made up myself and then found out later from another colleague that I have a colleague, a historian, who also has thought through his work with this concept. And we each came to it independently, but I came to the parallax view from childhood practice of looking at a star next to it rather than head on. The actual star in the sky, that star becomes more clear. And astronomers are the ones who named it parallax view. And so I thought, well, that's a really interesting way, juxtapose some things and try to see new relationships, try to figure out this conundrum. And so then I thought, well, I need a thing, right? It's too abstract to say identity. Identity actually is put into practice. Identity does stuff in real life, right? And so I looked at various philosophers' work and came up with this notion of what is a thing, and looked at now what are the most productive things that I can think of that would answer this kind of question about channels into identity as a problematic, in my opinion, problematic concept. And that was Obeah and Hosay. And they seemed very promising because they also posed, to me, a similar kind of contradiction in that they are, on the one hand, characterized and acknowledged to be very heterogeneous in their elements and in their practitioners, right? But at the same time, they are typified as respectively either African or Indian, right? As in South Asian Indian, right? And so I always had wondered about why is that? Because it's not that scholars and observers and practitioners and everybody, policymakers and everybody else aren't aware of these dual characterizations that seem to work together with conveniently and inconveniently. depending on the context. And so the book is an exploration of Hosay and Obeah. I'm winding down now. But I want to really stress that there is so much fantastic work, as you all know, on Obeah and on Hosay as well, that they were the engines, they were the vehicles through which I really wanted to get back to the concept of identity. And ultimately, I wanted to end up with a kind of invitation, and which is what my conclusion of the book is. In other words, I wanted to think about a way to contribute to the conversations among scholars and others, activists, of course, about the limits as well as the value of the concept of identity. And so I try to think about limits as lying, again, I had to find something kind of concrete. I try to think of those limits as lying in the essence of identity, at least in the Western epistemology, and that is the construct of the individual, right? And this sort of the neoliberal subject, as many people have talked about it, right? This concept in Western epistemology. And so I end with a kind of, thought, basically ruminations about what are we going to do with the absolutely progressive potential of identity, and how we can't at this moment expunge it from the record. And I talk about the various reasons why. It's what we have, right? And yet at the same time, how do we work it so that it doesn't reiterate those very hindrances and inequalities and oppressions that we're trying to rise above and dismantle, right? So that's, so in a sense, it's a little bit of a bait and switch. I do talk a lot about Obeah and Hosay, but my main objective is really is kind of a bit of an exegesis on the problem of the concept of identity, particularly racial and religious, if you can guess from the two topics of Obeah and Hosay, where I say the intersectionality that is key is racial and religious in perpetuating either optimistic hope or pessimistic repetition. So I think that's brevity is not my strong point. So I think I'll stop now and we can move on. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Khan. So we'll move on next to comments from Professor Kamari Clark.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. And of course, congratulations to Aisha for a wonderfully inspiring book. It's daunting to comment on a book like this that takes on so much and calls for a new way of engaging with race at the intersection of these religious forms as a way to think through identity. I felt illuminated by it and deeply invigorated by its arguments. Now, in The Deepest Dye, Aisha Khan explores identity in relation to where and how it happened, she says. She interrogates within what historical structures or through what conditions of meanings identity takes shape. And in fact, through an exploration of two mutually constituted sets of practices, she, following Heidegger, as she said earlier, identifies a thing as a means to chart the complex processes in the making of the Atlantic world. Now, for Khan, that thing was personified in the backstories of race and religion, she says. And that is where we see the manifestation of Obeah and Hosay cultural domains. And as she shows, both emerged in the context of slavery, British colonialism, the politics of employment, different forms of employment through which common Creole knowledge formations took shape. And so what we get in The Deepest Dye then is the book detailing the way that Hosay and Obeah are typically studied individually, but as she shows, the shared colonial context for both represent cases for exploring how race and religious identities are transformed by their mixture. As a key intervention, she asks, what is the gap in anthropology and religion that allows us to miss interrelations between Obeah and Hosay? And ultimately, those questions allow her to think more complexly about the limits and potentials of identity itself. And so in an effort to define Obeah in the earlier part of the book, Aisha sees Obeah in relation to Hosay, which is really a critical and wonderfully invigorating intervention that she makes from the beginning of the text. And so in defining Obeah, it's clear for her, even though it's a thing, it's not a thing, that it's not simply a distinct practice, but they are interrelated. That you can't see one without seeing the other. They exist in relation to each other. And she shows that the formation of Obeah was part of a moment in which new legal practices and moral imperatives took shape and produced the cosmologies of Caribbean religions in their dual fluidity and heterodoxy. So Obeah's making is fragmented and ambivalent, she tells us. It reflects the complex legacies of what she calls disapproving skeptics, admiring scholars, and governmental officials, end quote. British colonizers first made Obeah illegal in the West Indian colonies in 1760, following the Tacky's rebellion of enslaved peoples in Jamaica. And through its constitution as both agentive or an agentive practice and one that was demonized, she tells us that Obeah came to be known as an elusive catch-all term that's difficult to define, but that was rendered into a unitary phenomena through colonial lawmaking and colonial law enforcing. And as she says, its ubiquity makes it both easy to find and to prosecute, as well as difficult to eradicate. And then the book unfolds. We get the story about Hosay, its dynamic emergence, again in relation to Obeah, but in relation to a much larger context. And so in the case of Hosay, it's a religion of complex social relations that emerged as a result of indentured laborers from India who merged Sunni Muslim practices with Hindu practices, with what she calls a West Indian religious formation. And so from large-scale materials that symbolize tombs of the founding brothers that commemorated the leading figures undertaken by religious devotees, Hosay came to be formed in the same way that Obeah was formed, through the enmeshment of various weapons of the weak. The practices deployed various festive, carnivalesque, combative tools to aid conditions of post-emancipation. And so at the core of the book is a desire to combine the religious emergence of Hosay and Obeah with racialized action. Aisha insists that Hosay reinforced racial distinctness through an Indian essence that was racialized, especially in contradistinction to Blackness and Africanness. And Obeah, she also articulates for us, reinforced Blackness and Africanness. And this is the conundrum that the book takes up in its search for a new theory of identity. Racialization, colonialism, Christianity, labor, the making and the interplay of hybrid religious practices that were at once Islamic, African, Indian, traditional, agentive, many, many things, combative. And all of these are part of the combustion that is the making of the Atlantic world and these religious practices within it. And so in the context of this wonderfully dynamic text that offers a way of thinking differently about the way that we study race and religion in our work, I'd like to end by reflecting on two sets of questions that the book takes up that I would like to trouble a bit more, and I think I want to continue to read and think through, both when I assign it in my classes, but as well as I think about my own work and some of the case studies that Professor Khan discusses throughout the text. And so one of the set of questions that I want to raise has to do with the ordinariness of law in relation to the ways that identity and race are taken up in this text, and its law and its ability to make and transform practices through its mundane violence. So I'd like to start by reflecting on that and its implications for this argument. And then the other has to do with empire and inequality as an optic for making sense of the larger landscapes within which Hosay and Obeah have taken shape. Okay, so first, law in relation to this text, and I have to say that by raising these problematics, I'm hoping that we can continue in the discussion, the implications of what I'm going to say. So one of the most fascinating aspects of Khan's book for me is her attempt to consider how legal decisions, demeaning attitudes, legal scandals serve to produce Obeah as well as Hosay religions. Through a copious rendering of legal archives, fear, rumor, scandals, we see how law and the responses and practices surrounding it shaped people's relationship to the religions under study. And yet, it's worth considering how mundane this aspect of the law that calls out religion really is. It's worth considering that it was not the legal hegemonies and scandals that established Obeah and Hosay as Caribbean religions. It was the very ordinariness of law and its work as a handmaiden of empire that shaped religion, rendering it underground or overground to be celebrated. What we see is that the normalcy of law, its labor exploitation, its shaping of human value, and its ability to enable particular types of extraction shaped the foundational role of race through which it routinized violence. And as such, it's worth considering how approaching law, not through its extraordinary spectacles alone, but through what Walter Benjamin, for example, referred to as its ordinary violence, which allows us to normalize law's work as a function of its mundane violence. So for the challenge with normalizing law as a distinct instrument or a mechanism that calls upon people and influences their practices, is that we actually can miss the reality of law, the reality that the reality which often is the violence of its work. And so the deepest eye straddles this tension, but doesn't fully resolve it in an interesting way. And part of what I want to draw out here for further discussion in thinking about law is that the book's tapestry of legal decisions are articulated as if law exists outside of religion. It shows how various legal decisions against Hosay, for example, or Obeah practitioners have actually been quite scandalous, from Tacky's rebellion to UK and Canadian jurisprudence to Trinidadian, Guyanese, Jamaican cases over the post-independence period. But actually, what would it look like to embed law in the foundational operations of Hosay and Obeah as a way to frame it as law? So these practices that are the thing are themselves law as cultural norms that shape its form, its orthodoxy, its processes of naturalization. Such a purview allows us to reckon with law as religion and religion as law, with dissolved nomenclature, and to contend with the originary violence that constituted the religious inequality that rendered Hosay and Obeah within their historical and contemporary forms. So that's the first comment about law. What is it, and how do we think about it within and outside of these religious practices? The second point that I wanted to raise has to do with Khan's investment in the workings of race and religion as mutually constituting sets of relations. And her framing, of course, is critically important, and in many ways will help to advance the discipline in this area, as it reminds us of the need to study religions not as entities in and of themselves, but as inseparable co-constituted relations. And I think that contribution is key, is critical, and really does make a mark on how we unpack and make sense of the formations as they took shape historically and in the contemporary period. And so thus to understand Obeah is to hold it in tension with, in this case, Hosay, and to understand Hosay is to explore it in relation to Obeah. But what if we were to reconsider the constituting thing that is Obeah and Hosay? What if instead Obeah and Hosay as things, what if instead of Obeah and Hosay as things that shape the relation, they are not the things to be followed? And I think that toward the end of the book, this is really where the book comes to life in taking up the questions that concerns Aisha the most. What if the thing is the relation, that is inequality fueled through empire, plantation and colonial markets, relations that make diasporic religious formations and embed them with particular value? So what if this value is not about the thing that Khan has followed, but is actually a proxy for empire? And so for while Khan, as she explains, Obeah and Hosay religions established racial boundaries through which social distinctions were established, it's also worth considering how racialized differentiation and color hierarchies were proxies for empire. And today, of course, we know functions as mechanisms through which inequality guarantees particular racialized orders, including gendered orders and other orders. Now, inequality through devaluing or through the devaluing of people shapes the meanings and hierarchies that produced these racial distinctions. And it was the markets and relations of value shaped by empire that devalued difference and that created hierarchies between and among religions. So the question for me provoked by this book is, what would Khan's argument look like if the optic for analysis was not the thing of Obeah and Hosay, as she outlines it in the opening and talking through her methodology and her conceptualization? So not the thing of Obeah and Hosay, but the practices such as segregated work, branding, no pay, minimal pay for work, particular contracts. So what if it was those practices that shaped racial differentiation that led to the devaluation of racialized life? Such a point of departure would insist that it's not the tensions between, or that we think through to what extent it is the tensions between Hosay and Obeah that created them in relation to each other and West Indian plantation life. So rather inequality and empire. So part of the foil that I'm pushing back with is to what extent inequality and empire is actually what constituted them. And through that process, racial differentiation was produced. And by extension, these religious forms that are mutually co-constituted. And so these are just some preliminary thoughts, but the book really does offer us so much to ponder and appreciate. And I say with confidence that it truly is an instant classic that will continue to invigorate debates on some of these topics for years to come. So thanks for the opportunity to engage with it. Aisha, congrats on the phenomenal intervention into African diasporic literature, race, religion in the diasporic and Atlantic world. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the follow-up discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark, for those comments. I just wanted to remind the audience as well that as you're thinking about your questions, you can use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be taking those questions up after we've heard from all of our discussants. So next, we're moving to Professor Diana Payton.
Thank you so much, and good evening or good afternoon to everyone here. It's lovely to see some familiar names in the list of participants, even though I can't see your faces. And I'd like to extend in particular thanks to the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora for the opportunity to discuss Professor Aisha Khan's book, The Deepest Dye, Obeah, Hosay, and Race in the Atlantic World, and in such wonderful company. And congratulations to Aisha on the publication of this important work. The deepest dye, as we've already heard, I think, is a remarkable interdisciplinary achievement, combining archival research, close literary reading, ethnography, and sociological and anthropological theory. The deepest dye works by weaving together effectively theorized readings of multiple events and texts. And those are mainly drawn from readings of archival and print material, but Khan also makes use of ethnographic observation over decades of work in Trinidad, as well as new ethnographic research in Canada. So this is a boundary crossing work in multiple senses. It ranges geographically across the Caribbean to Canada and to India, and it ranges methodologically from ethnography to historical methods and to close readings of literary texts. Personally, it's a real pleasure to be in dialogue with another scholar on topics and sources with which I've also spent a lot of time. So many of the themes and sources that Aisha Khan discusses also feature in my book, The Cultural Politics of Obeah. So for instance, and this, I'm giving you this list partly for those of you who haven't read the book to give you a bit more of a sense of some of the content in the book. Brian Edwards's, and before him, Edward Long's account of the 18th century Dahomean woman who was in Jamaica, was accused of Obeah, and whose story became one of the most revisited accounts of Obeah in early 19th century Britain. Or the colonial governor Hesketh Bell's book, Obeah, Witchcraft in the West Indies from the late 19th century, or the Moyne Commission of the 1930s, consideration of Obeah in relation to the labor uprising of that decade, labor uprisings of that decade, or Barry Records' play, Della, which also went by the name Adela, or Flesh to a Tiger. So you can hear from that kind of range, this sort of extraordinary range of topics and periods and places that Aisha is dealing with in this book. And it was personally a pleasure to revisit some of those sources, those moments in Caribbean history and in colonial discourse. But at the heart of The Deepest Dye is an investigation of how the categories of race and religion have been made and remade in the colonial and post-colonial Caribbean. In thinking through the concept of identity, Aisha wants us to think about, and I'm going to quote her here, the racialization of religion and the religionization of race. And I think that's a really memorable and significant phrase that perhaps we can interrogate a bit further today. So to investigate this dual and recursive process, Professor Khan takes as the object of her study two constellations of meaningful practice and embodied belief, both of which have been historically marginalized, stigmatized, and sometimes actively repressed, Obeah and Hosay. Each, as we've already heard, is the subject of an extensive literature in itself, but they've never before been discussed together in this way. And I think Khan weaves these literatures about each of these topics together in a really constructive dialogue. As she brilliantly demonstrates, each is a racialized category. Obeah, a catch-all term for practices of healing and power that are associated with Africanness and Blackness. Hosay, a Caribbean iteration of the Islamic Muharram festival, which first arrived in the region with indentured workers from India. And is strongly associated with Indianness. So here we have the racialization of religion, these two categories that partake of the religious, although are usually not credited as being religions, and the distinction there is a significant one. These categories are associated with particular groups that are defined by heredity and by phenotype. And at the same time, we have the religionization of race, which I think is a less obvious concept to grasp and a harder concept to grasp perhaps, and one I'd love to hear Aisha discuss a bit further. I take it to mean that at a particular moment in Caribbean life, the master symbols by which racial groups came to be defined and understood were religious symbols, that is Obeah and Hosay. And that makes a huge amount of sense and is very helpful, I think, in understanding these societies. But there's also clearly a paradox here, which Aisha goes into in the book, both in colonial discourse and also in everyday life in the Caribbean. These discursive groupings undoubtedly do work. Obeah, Blackness, Africa on the one hand, and Hosay, Islam, India, and also perhaps, and in a contradictory way, Hinduism on the other. But at the same time, everyone knows that these are not exclusive associations. As Khan states, Obeah never has been exclusive to Afro-Caribbeans except in Euro-colonial racial thinking. And we could say the same, but in reverse for Hosay. So in my own work on prosecutions for Obeah, I found that African and Indian Trinidadians and African and Indian Jamaicans made use often of quite similar strategies for healing and for invoking spiritual power, and that both were prosecuted under laws against Obeah, although to different extents. And meanwhile, the appeal of the marketing strategies of the De Lawrence Company, which used exoticizing images of India to sell its mystical books to those scientists, doctors, and professors who do what is often termed Obeah, those marketing strategies show that in certain contexts, preconceptions of India can be associated with Obeah just as much as with Hosay. Moreover, as Khan points out, Hosay's Caribbean devotees are today largely not Muslim, and that's probably always been the case. So although Obeah and Hosay racialize religion and religionize race, they do so in ways that are always partial and limited. Indeed, perhaps it's because these associations are clearly, once you get under their skin, partial, that there's been so much impetus on the part of the colonial and indeed the post-colonial state for them to be reinforced. And that's an area that I'd love to hear Aisha's thoughts on. What I found most challenging in writing about Obeah, and which I think is difficult also for Hosay, although I haven't written about it, was moving beyond an investigation of how colonial discourse works to understand how discourse and practice work in everyday life. Why, to take one question, is Obeah still stigmatized and feared in the Caribbean, as well as something with the power to attract more than 50 years after the end of colonial rule? And in my own work, I tried to get at these questions relating to ordinary life, everyday life, mainly through the use of court cases, examining what people who found themselves in court accused of Obeah or other religious crimes said about their practice, belief, and identity. Now, of course, that's not a complete solution to this problem, because people are in court. When people are in court, they say things that they hope will benefit themselves in that situation. And I think the anthropologist perhaps has a wider toolkit to address this kind of problem and concern. And I'd love to hear more from Professor Khan about her methodological choices in relation to that issue of wanting to unpack colonial discourse, but also wanting to get beyond colonial discourse and to think about the problematics of everyday life. So let me end my 10 minutes by noting that in an era in which I think there is a shift towards essentialist conceptions of race, Khan's laser-sharp focus on race as a constructed category of identity and power is a necessary and an important point of reference. Her concept of the parallax view of race and identity, of glancing sideways rather than head on, is one that I think will be productive in other scholarship. As she points out, both race and religion only become things, become coherent objects, because of the processes that make them seem so. And I think she gives us some really wonderful insights into some of those processes. So I know that I'm going to return to this work frequently. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Professor Payton. And next we will have comments from Professor Reddick. Can you unmute, please, Professor Reddick? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel and to comment on the work, the epic work of my colleague, Aisha Khan, with whom I have collaborated over a number of years. Aisha Khan's latest volume joins what many have described as a growing body of literature, reflecting a renewed interest in Obeah. She combines this with an exploration of her longtime interest in Hosay. The Deepest Dye is therefore both a shift and a continuation of her Caribbean explorations. It is similar in that it deals with her continuing concerns with religion and its intersections with ethnicity and culture. However, it is different as it is not primarily ethnographic, and especially in relation to Obeah, it provides a discursive excursion through colonial correspondence, travel writing, and official reports. It also engages broadly with the wider Caribbean, in some ways moving beyond pervasive assumptions of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyanese cultural and ethnic distinctiveness. At first, I was intrigued at the bringing together of two such disparate phenomena, Obeah and Hosay. I wondered, for example, why Obeah, when there were other more substantive African-inspired religious traditions, for example, shouters and shakers in Trinidad and Tobago and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and numerous others elsewhere. As she observed, Obeah comprises a broad array of ancient religious traditions that hail from West and Central Africa, while Hosay, originally a Shia Muslim, but now mainly a folk festival brought from India, was a more boundaried spatial and temporal presence. What for Khan justified this coming together? Throughout the text, she prefers a number of reasons. For example, both Obeah and Hosay, despite their origins elsewhere, are indigenous Caribbean reconstructions, she argues, constructed by colonized peoples' structural and hierarchical engagement with the colonial system and its criminalization, stigmatization, and demonization of non-Christian traditions of Africans and Indians. The legacy of this being, of course, the racialization of religion and the religionization of race, which continues to characterize the region today. As a result, Obeah and Hosay, along with other, what Aisha refers to as identity categories, religions, ethnic groups, cultural events, tend to be studied separately and distinctly and become individually interpreted as African and Indian, respectively. By examining these together, she argues, we can better understand the ways in which racial and religious identities are transformed by relations of power and experience into markers of difference. This raised additional questions for me. What accounts for the preservation of these identities? And why and for what reasons are they maintained? And relatedly, whose interests do they serve? This legacy of ethno-religio identification has today in Trinidad and Tobago, and probably elsewhere in the region, become a conscious instrument and an important strategic intervention in the everyday social, political, and economic contestations among various identity categories. For example, they provide acceptable mechanisms through which ethno-racial demands, cloaked in religious garb, become legitimate representations in the eyes of the state, the community, and even those who oppose. These distinct characterizations deny the creative interactions and possibilities that these hybrid phenomena provide. They exist to contest the Creole and hybrid imperative and to maintain the basis for a plural society. They remind us that Caribbean societies, especially those in the Southern Caribbean, are Creole and hybrid, but also plural at the same time. In this work, Aisha Khan goes a long way in challenging these constructed identity categories around Obeah and Hosay. It would be interesting, however, to see the ways in which Obeah and Hosay themselves intersected and how Obeah and Hosay in their everyday practice moved beyond their own boundaries. In relation to Obeah, this is analyzed in the book independent of its associations with other African-influenced religious practice. For example, Shouters, Spiritual Baptists, Radas, Shango or Orisha, and others elsewhere in the region. These are the groups that are often associated with this practice, although this should not be exclusive, and who in the past were routinely arrested and charged using the Obeah legislation. Although defined as African, already by the early 20th century, as we heard from Diana just before, Obeah practitioners' pantheon of knowledge was diverse, drawing from African, African-American, European, and subaltern strands of Hindu practice. For example, Kali and Shakti devotion. Holy books included those written by Albertus Magnus, the Grand Albert, and Le Petit Albert, as well as the 6th and 7th, but also the 8th, 9th, and 10th books of Moses, as well as books on hypnotism, spiritualism, Kabbalah, and instructions in Orientalized Egyptian and Hindu magic. Already by the turn of the 20th century, this unstable and defining category of Obeah was already used as a mode, as noted by Rocklin, as a mode of disqualifying a whole range of subaltern knowledge, including those drawn from Africa, Euro-America, and India. The Obeah legislation pulled in all, including, as Diana mentioned, Indian sadhus, all charged with practicing Obeah. The negative connotations of Africanity, Blackness, and Black magic, as well as Obeah's illegality, stigmatized it, drove it underground, sometimes causing certain practitioners to distance themselves from it. But this did not stop its attractiveness or its availability to all. Indeed, Indians introduced new practices, such as jare, sweeping away the sickness with dubé grass or peacock feather, or the recitation of a prayer, mantra, or surah from the Quran, coupled with blowing on the patient, as noted by Rocklin. Sipasad Naipaul's mid-20th century story, Obeah, chronicles a Kayan worker solicitation of a local Obeah man, and this is the language that Naipaul uses. In this case, the Obeah man was a Devi Puja healer, that is a healer coming out of the Shakti tradition, to solve his love problem. So already from very early, the word Obeah was expanded beyond the African traditions to include other strands of similar practice. Recent research suggests that despite acceptance by Indians that Obeah is an African thing, along with the integration of Indian practices, Indians comprise a significant proportion of the clients of Obeah. Nevertheless, despite its wide acceptance and practice, Obeah is not a celebrated symbol of African identity. The author's engagement with Hosay differs completely from her engagement with Obeah. In this section, I argue she moves back to her familiar ethnographic role as observer, interviewer, and the lens through which local voices come to light. Although the engagement with historical text is there, it is the ethnography that carries this section. What becomes clear is the everyday importance to its practitioners of Hosay to Indian identity and as a symbol of Indian, more recently, as a symbol of Indian resistance. Like Obeah, although defined as Indian, Hosay is not the Indian festival that it once was, largely due to its location as a Muslim festival in a Hindu-dominated society and its contested status as an Islamic religious commemoration. When Hosay, especially in St. James, shifted from being a people's and community festival, as it had been for Hindus and Muslims in India, to being a religious festival in response to complaints from mainline Islamic organizations, it lost some of its broad availability. This may be one of the reasons for its diminution, as mentioned in the book. In the same way that efforts were made by middle-class elements to purify Shango and Orisha practice by removing its Christian and Hindu elements, something which was resisted, there were once again efforts to reconstruct Hosay as a holy festival with greater public attention to the prayers and fasting that accompanied it. In St. James, this meant the loss of sponsorship from the bars, as alcohol is haram for Muslims. And that sponsorship was critical as it supported Tajak construction, a kind of interplay of the sacred and the profane. Nevertheless, as shown in Aisha's test, participation tends to be diverse, not only in the prayers and preparations, as she described so sympathetically, but also by the large number of African and Dogla meaning mixtures of African and Indian, men and boys who participate in the procession of tassa drums, many not Muslim or Hindu, participating in an ancient ritualized formation, possibly derived from centuries ago in India or possibly Persia. It is interesting that both Cedros and St. James, the communities where Hosay has had its longest endurance, are mixed communities with long traditions of interethnic and interreligious collaboration. It is in these communities that Hosay survived, suggesting that its support was drawn from a broader group. Yet Hosay continues to be defined as Indian, a position strengthened more recently when Hindu and Christian activists adopted the 1984 Hosay riots as an Indian resistance moment, renaming it the Jahaji Massacre, a term to include all Indians. In conclusion, creolization makes both Hosay and Obeah available to all, yet they maintain their distinct identities as African and Indian in a context where maintaining plurality, especially to Indians in the Southern Caribbean, I would like to suggest by a strange Creole twist, is now embedded within the national psyche. National identity, therefore, is characterized by an ever-growing listing of ethnic and religious identities. Obeah, because of its fluidity and perhaps its distance from any single religion, makes it even more widely available than Hosay, with its spatial, temporal, and other boundaries. Yet we see borrowings, for example, continue between Carnival and Hosay, with shared costume making and wire bending skills. Yet Hosay and Obeah are of course connected. Khan hinted at the underlying concern among Hosay practitioners with secrets, the danger of not performing the rituals properly, fear of bad consequences, spiritual power, and the link to the dark forces of Obeah. In other words, Obeah goes beyond religion. It is part of a Caribbean culture available as a resource for use by people of all religious traditions. The attempt to maintain Hosay's religious identity is a survival mechanism in the face of mainstream Islam, but it is always important to maintain its authenticity as an Indian festival. Those who ensure that these racialized religious or vice versa identifications continue or are strengthened, even as the festival itself faces its diminution, and those whose natural everyday interaction, family, friendship, community, and other connections engage in this historic but contemporary practice represent the two continuous and contiguous forces that make the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago the multicultural space that it is today. The continuous contestations and negotiations between the plural, or the so-called plural, and the hybrid or Creole. Today, racialized religion and religionized race continue to be used as righteous proxies for socioeconomic contests, negotiations over power and control, and national politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddick. We now have time for Professor Khan to respond and to comment some more on the work that she was doing with this text.
Well, first, let me say thank you so much to all of my interlocutors on the panel. Again, not only for spending so much real thoughtful energy on thinking about what I was trying to say, but also grasping it. I really appreciate, everybody always appreciates being understood and in terms of exactly what they wanted to convey. So for that as well, I'm very grateful. Let me just do this in reverse order because I want to make sure if there are Q&A moments that we need to get to, I don't want to take up too much time. Plus, as I said, brevity is not my strong suit. So let me go in reverse order and just say thank you, Rhoda, for grasping what I was trying to convey and doing such a beautiful summary of all of the ins and outs that I raise in my discussion of Hosay as well as Obeah. But I think one of the things that you underscored that I'm, was attempting to, put in the front space of at the head of the table. That's the expression I'm looking for. Is that, we have this a kind of tension among participants and practitioners themselves about how they want to identify with a particular tradition or something that's a practice that's meaningful to them in a way that will represent some specific thing. So as you noted, and as I discuss at length when I talk about contemporary Hosay and my almost 30 years of field work on it in Trinidad, much of the argument among Hosay participants themselves is whether or not this is religion at all. What, how can we claim it as being a part of some kind of essential Indianness, right? Because I think, Rhoda, as you implied, religion is perhaps more easily shared than essential genealogical heritage, right? And so teasing that out really is the rich tapestry that comes out of contemporary voices that can be heard rather than colonial or colonized, voices in the colonial milieu that are not heard, that can't be heard, or that are, if not silenced altogether, then ridiculed and marginalized. And so I think some of the richest tensions about what Hosay means today and its relationship to race as well as religion comes out of this contemporary moment, which is why I as you put it, return to my comfort zone. I really appreciate that compliment. The ethnography is our jam, right? As anthropologists, so I appreciate that. I think that where I heard the most starkly the real ambivalences about the Hosay as a form of racial identity and religious identity comes through these, some of them old timers, and as I mentioned, some of their grandchildren who I am talking with, even though I knew their grandparents back in the day. And so I think, again, for what I wanted, absolutely, Rhoda and all of, and Kamari and Diana also are pointing out is places we can go from here. and that's exactly what I said in my conclusion also toward the end is I did not intend, and as you all obviously appreciate, that this is not a foreclosure. I didn't do a throwdown. I have spoken. It's because I said so. I really feel so gratified that this is something that we can hopefully, in our various ways, continue to take up into the future. And so, yes, Rhoda, I would the ever seemingly unending tension between, is this a separate phenomenon, and what kind of boundaries do we draw around it, or in fact, is this a very heterogeneous, diverse phenomena, and how do we blur those boundaries, and why? And as you put it, in whose interests? That's a very much the million-dollar question that I address in the book. And I agree with you 100% that these are today, as in the colonial era, these were filtered through the power of the state, as well as the agency of grassroots efforts. And I think power and agency are a nice way to at least begin to make this differentiation or this distinction, right? Of course, they're not apples and oranges. They're not that different. But I think talking in terms of power and agency maybe will help us also think about, what are the filters that highlight certain vested interests and stakes in all of this. So I'm delighted that your comments brought out that what I was trying to get at in all of this soup, this callaloo, if you will, that's so rich and endlessly fascinating. Just to be very quick now, I'm going to go a little out of order and thank Kamari again profusely for your couple of questions. And I think I'm going to collapse them. And you asked about the law and the abilities of the laws and legal decisions to produce Obeah, and of course, by extension, Hosay. And you were interested in the normalcy of the law. And I know Diana can weigh in on this because Kamari and Diana are the experts here on legal systems, the judiciary, and law. But I find it as a newcomer to the law and to the judicial exercises, find this fascinating, the normalcy of the law. And I think that, again, I want to connect it to Kamari's question about empire and inequality as an optic for making sense of larger landscapes. And that's what I was trying to do. And I thank you so much, Kamari, for picking that up and highlighting it. That's what I was trying to do when I talk about the context of the plantation, which is in the earlier part of the book, and the climates of crisis, as I characterize it, that are so suffused throughout plantation life that it becomes a kind of common sense, which is another concept that I employ in the book. That it becomes the suffusion of crisis and anxiety stemming directly from the slave plantation and then shifting into the indenture plantation, which I argue are overlapping in many kinds of ways. Not entirely, and not entirely indistinct, but also distinct and indistinct in very, I think, important ways. And to think about the way that the law, various kinds of laws were exercised in terms of creating a larger landscape that you refer to. And as I argue in the book, primarily, I'm starting with the plantation. I think you could start with other entities, or elements, but that's where I saw the most clear relationships between Obeah and Hosay, given that it comes out of labor. And that's one of the things I really wanted to stress also, that these identity formations and contestations and repulsions and embracing have to really be looked at in terms of Caribbean histories of labor. And I guess you could certainly argue that for the US. I would argue that for the US as well, and other parts of the world I'm not so familiar with. But that foundation of labor, I think, is a key element to Kamari's wonderful question about the normalcy of law. And I'll tell you that where I'm taking it today, in the last couple of years, I've had now a chance to embark on a bit of a different project, and that's on the carceral state and the prison industrial complex. But where I came to that from was exactly what Kamari raised in terms of the criminalization that becomes part of the common sense of everyday life. And maybe one of the ways to think about alternative optics, as Kamari, I think, is suggesting, in addition to the ones that I have, not instead of, but in addition to, I do appreciate that a lot, Kamari. But maybe one of these other optics is criminalization. And I have to say, and I noted this in the conclusion, that, you know, when I was writing the conclusion, it was in the terrible spring and summer of 2020. And we all remember all too clearly. And I began to really, for myself, be able to make these kinds of connections that were, you know, phenomenally depressing, but also stimulated my being able to think for myself in terms of connections from past to present, right? I didn't want to just recite that, you know, the plantation is the locus of what we are, the racism and the anti-Blackness and structural racism that we face today. I believe that, obviously, but I was able to think through during this terrible time period how we might think that, what these filaments actually are. And others have done this as well in other ways, right? But I think that criminalization, I thought, gosh, as I say in the conclusion, maybe identity has to be criminalized into being, just as it has to be lauded into being, right? Celebrated into being. And maybe that's the root of the problem with the individual in identity, because the individual seems to, in Western epistemology, only have a choice between being criminalized or being lauded, right? Being respectable, right? And so I would, you know, in my next or continuing foray into these questions, I will not be able to turn myself into a legal scholar at this ripe old age, but I will certainly look to your work to help me think through how to better understand these processes of criminalization that make law and legal practices normalized, right? And so I thank you very much for that. And then last but not least, my friend and colleague Diana Payton, because I don't want to take too much time. I think that Diana, you asked a couple of questions. One is to talk a little bit more about the religious symbols that represent racial categories and identities. And because I agree with you, I think the religionization of race, absolutely 100%. This has dogged my intellectual capabilities for a long time. I think that's harder to get at. I absolutely agree with you that for some, than the racialization of religion, and not because one is more sensible than the other, absolutely not. And that's not what you meant, but in terms of maybe racializing, in terms of at least our contemporary optic might be easier to pinpoint, right? The religionization of race may seem a little more elusive and diffuse because religion is a little bit, as I talk about in the book, they're not, you know, how I understand the way that the different role these concepts play in personhood, right? And shaping personhood. So I think just very quickly on that note, because again, I want to hurry up here, but I would love to, look, you know, when we all can, all of us need to sit down with coffee or maybe something else and continue this. But I think that I would say that religious symbols come to represent and be stand-ins for racial categories, with charging folks with being Obeah aficionados, devotees, practitioners, and ditto for Hosay. And so that they become, like Stuart Hall says, sliding signifiers, right? Which I also mentioned a little bit in the book, Hall's notion. So that religion, it's interesting, religious practices or traditions, whatever makes them religious, dealing with the cosmos, the supernatural, whatever it is, that again, Western epistemology, that's what we're working with, right? However that epistemology defines religion, that those qualities or features come to represent race automatically without even having to explain how, right? So that the wily Hindu is code, right? The savage Hosay participant on colonial plantations becomes code. And so I think, the language of code and the discourses of code is really interesting here for substitutions, right? That become, again, part of common sense. Okay, I know Indian hill tribes, just like the savages on the continent of Africa, right? And there becomes, again, a kind of commonsensical code work that goes on. And so I never even said this out loud. So thank you very much for helping me think this through on the cuff, right? And your last question, then I'll stop, is that you wanted to know a little bit more about my methodological choices and in unpacking colonial discourses. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your mentioning, there's a lot of terrain covered here. And I had the most fun talking about, Netflix series and Windrush Generation playwrights, which I don't usually do. And delving into archives in a way that you, of course, is for all of you on the panel, I think is a deeper immersion than I have had, except for the last few years, right? And so I just wanted to say that, very, very briefly, I don't have anything really fancy. I could make it more fancy if I had time, but just very briefly, my methodological choices were really limited by, as I said in the introduction in my last section on an anthropologist doing history or historiography, is really I had to do two things: look at what documentation was there in the archives, and then impose a kind of what I like to call and have called elsewhere creative skepticism, right? And so it helps me make inferences, but in a way that is not entirely in line with what I think the messages intended by those recorded voices necessarily convey, if that makes sense. And so, I listened to Luke Cage's screenplay and read Flesh to a Tiger, and read, Lord, so-and-so's missive to, the other Lord, the cranky missive, in pretty much the same way, in terms, just trying to use anthropological techniques of interpretation to, as I say in the introduction, to extrapolate, but educated inferences, which means you have to know something about what you're reading about. But my methodological approach kind of was, maybe you could say, a constant variable as I applied it to different arenas. And I hope that's satisfactory for right now. And let me just wrap up by saying thank you, everybody, so much. I'm very energized right now, so, which is good. I have a class in a little while. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you, Professor Khan, for that response. We have time for question and answer with the audience, and we already have one question in queue in the Q&A. So I'll just remind the audience that you can participate by posting a question in the Q&A. Before we turn to that question, I just wanted to check in with the panelists whether there was any follow-up questions or responses either to each other or to Professor Khan before we went to the audience questions. Nope. Okay. So first question from Mohan Ambi Kaipakar. Congratulations, Aisha, and what a wonderful panel. My question, to what extent do you think the rubric of diaspora, with its transnational but bounded descent-based knowledge production, tends to help or hinder understanding of the Creole plural dynamics of race and religion in Hosay and Obeah taking place in the Caribbean?
Thank you very much for that question, Mohan. And I'm going to, again, do a very short answer for now. And that is, I think concepts like diaspora and other gatekeeping, I would argue, just my one tiny nanosecond moment of disagreeing with Rolf Trio about the Caribbean being subject to gatekeeping concepts or not. I think that diaspora, like creolization and a number of other, not that many, but a few other concepts have acted as, let's say, key tropes. If gatekeeping is too loaded and critical as key tropes of the region. And I think sometimes in scholars, and myself included, I've been guilty of this as well, is we get so wrapped up in trying to understand the concept, trying to foreground unpacking the concept, that the application of the concept to the actual things that it is referring to, not in the Heideggerian sense, but the stuff that the lived experience that it's referring to gets lost. So, I'm not sure. Like, for example, I think it was very useful, Stuart Hall's definition of diaspora, where he says it's explicitly, it's only Caribbean and it's only, it's about heterogeneous populations in the Caribbean only. And I'm sorry, I'm doing him a profound injustice, which is terrible because I love Stuart Hall. But I think that again, I would take a little bit of a departure from that, except, of course, to say, well, it depends on how you want to use it. So for me, theoretical concepts are valuable only in as much as they, again, this is the anthropologist talking, as they illuminate the lived experience, that little slice of lived experience that you want to look at. So I got some traction out of talking about diaspora, like a lot of other people. I'm not, I would never deny that. And it was fun to think about, but I'm not sure that how much it would, this concept would lend itself to the kinds of conundra and fascinations that I'm talking about. But by that, I'm also adding, it's not irrelevant by any means. Sorry, somebody's calling me, never mind. But I'm not sure I would foreground it until I figured out how is it really helping me understand and tell a story about lived experience.
So we have another question from Marit Ford. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. A question about art. One of your interlocutors, Derek, talks about Hosay as art, and you think through contemporary representations of Obeah in your analysis of plays, Luke Cage, etc. Could you say a bit more about this? Do you think the identity work Obeah and Hosay perform in the arts is any different from other discursive fields, such as law or politics? Do you think there's more space for the fluidity and heterogeneity of Obeah and Hosay in artistic representations?
Wow, that's a fabulous question, Marie, and I'm going to kill you because it's a great question, and boy, is it out of my, talk about comfort zone. But you're forcing me in a very productive way to think about it. And so I would, and actually, a great person to ask this, to weigh in. I'm not sure if she's here, but Pat Mohammed would be a great person who is an expert on all things art. But I will say that I think that what we're, the kind of fulcrum that you're talking about here, maybe, if I understand the question, is the workings of the imagination. and what are the various limits on the workings of the human imagination given different kinds of exercises of that imagination, right? And art is one, whether it's building the designing and building the Taj. I so love that you focused on Derek. Derek's like a totally awesome, interesting person. And you could, designing and building the Tajas, which are the tombs, or to writing short stories. All of this is a kind of art that still, has to obey certain kinds of laws of persuasion. Okay, right? I would say, and I'm just talking off the top of my head, but this is actually really interesting. So I think the arts have to obey certain laws or parameters, if you don't like laws, of persuasion or persuasiveness, whether it's a painting or a taja or a story, right? And I think other kinds of or a Netflix series, whatever, right? A play. And so I think there are certain ways that I guess I would say that art, I think, as its own kind of thing, I'm not sure how we want to bracket it out from other kinds of imaginary or imagined expression. I think that is contingent on what constitutes art and why is something not art, which are, these are $1 million questions too. But in terms of representations of Obeah and Hosay, again, through the human imagination, I think the limits would be certainly about the persuasiveness of your message, and also what is allowed in terms of limits around authenticity, right? For example, if I rode a horse through the streets, I'm not sure people would necessarily say that's authentic Hosay, right? I just picked something out. So I think that studying artistic expression as a kind of imaginative way of talking about human creativity. Let me just say in brief, it's already too late for in brief, but I would say just the short answer is I don't think there is. Can my short answer be no? Now that I've thought this through, I might have lost your question, but I think my short answer is no. Thank you.
Laurie, can I also respond to that? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Aisha, for getting us to start to think about that. And in fact, I'm sorry that Deb Thomas isn't here on the panel either because of the recent work that she's been doing on multimodality. But I suppose one of the ways that we could also think about art is the same way that we would think about the written word or law or jurisprudence, which is that they all have their imaginary modes. They're all ultimately about the translation of the human experience, that life is dynamic and there's always a failure once we try to reproduce a thing or express it outside of what it is. And that art provides one of those domains. It is a mode, just as words and literature and the written word. But maybe the challenge is always, or maybe the hub is really about the problem of translation, and the dynamism is that there are many modes through which we can understand human existence, human meaning making, the ways that people engage and interpret their lives and use religion to do so. And that there are many times when words, including the written word, fails us. And there are other modes that are far more effective because they don't fail us in the same way. They allow, maybe there's space for variability, there's space for interpretation, there's the sound, there's the smell, there are ways that it invokes other senses that words often don't. And partially because of the nature of the technocratic nature of knowledge, where, we have this framework to interpret words. You hear a word, you have a framework, and some of us don't have the same kinds of frameworks with other modes. And so I think it's a wonderfully provocative question, and I think that we have yet, as scholars, and especially for those of us who are not scholars of art and art history and multimodality, we have a lot of work to do around this sensorium and how we can not only lend legitimacy to these other domains of expression around which religion really can come to life, and the life of the world of the spirit and the world of feeling. But we have a lot of work to do where that's concerned, and I think we spend far too much time with the word and not enough time in these other modes. And it's not a critique of Aisha's book, but I think it's a critique of all of us, who depend on archives in particular ways, or depend on jurisprudence in particular ways, or depend on interviews. And sometimes, the other sensorium aren't part of it. So I really love that question, and it's worth continuing to think about, especially in the domain of African religions or diasporic religions.
Thank you for that, Kamari. If there are any other questions, please get them into the Q&A. I want to also just take this time to thank our panelists. Thank you so much. Professor Khan, Professor Clark, Professor Payton, and Professor Reddick for taking the time to engage this wonderful book. I'm reminding all of you it's available from Harvard University Press. Aisha, if I could just ask, are there things that you had to exclude that you're still thinking about from this text?
Oh, gosh, well, even I will say, even the things that are in the text, I'm still thinking about, because for me, it's an unfinished project, and that's a good thing, right? I think I'm always sort of, depressed when something seems finished. And then I think, well, where do we go from here? So given that the book is, as I said, I hoped a catalyst for to further all of these conversations, it's unfinished and I'm still thinking. But in terms of specific areas, I would say that, so are you saying that I had to leave out, or that I wish I had thought more about? Well, either one is okay.
Yes, I was thinking about things that you had to leave out.
Oh gosh. The short answer here, because I know we have little time, the original manuscript that I sent to my editor was 679 pages. Okay. And they freaked out, and I made everybody mad at HUP. I can, and then I had to like in a lightning speed, cut. So I would say that I left out, I had a whole kind of excursion into Enlightenment thought. I had much more discussion of the kind of historiography that I've taken from the panelists, by the way, on Obeah. Hosay I could kind of handle on my own, but I would say that there was, just think of it in these terms, since we don't have time to go into detail. Everything in the book was exponentially more, right? And so everything was trimmed down. What I would have liked to be able to look into more is to plow through my ethnographic data for folks not just running the camps and the yards and building the tajas. I mean, I thought that was a very rich chapter, and I had a lot of fun doing it. But I would like to have been able to bring in more of my other ethnographic data. But again, after that disaster of the size does matter, P.S., I couldn't. But I think we're out of time. So thank you for that, Lori.
Right. Thank you so much. So yes, we are at the end of our time. Again, I want to thank each of our panelists for your really constructive and thoughtful reading of Professor Khan's text. Congratulations again, Professor Khan, on a wonderful, wonderful contribution to multiple fields. And I just want to remind everybody to follow ASWAD on social media. Our handle is ASWAD Diaspora, and we are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So you'll get more information about our upcoming events, including an event we have coming up this spring with Carol Boyce Davies. So thank you again. Wonderful to have everyone here, and I'm wishing you a very peaceful and hopefully joyful semester. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Virtual hugs. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.